406 on 105.9 WMAL. Trying to make sense of the news. It's sometimes hard. I do my best. I'm Dan Mandis in for Vince. You can follow me on the socials at Dan Mandis Show. I want to welcome on into the program Gabe Kaminsky, investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner. And Gabe, I don't know why I'm not surprised by this, but you've written about how Tim Walz, of course, Kamala Harris's running mate in Minnesota's governor, he actually hosted a Muslim cleric who celebrated the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel. I want to delve into the details here because on the surface, again, doesn't surprise me, yet horrifying. Talk about this relationship.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This actually goes beyond this Muslim cleric whose name is Asad Zaman of the Muslim American Society of Minnesota, beyond him celebrating the Hamas-led October 7th attack last year. On at least 5 occasions since 2019, the Washington Examiner found that Tim Walz has met with Zaman, whom has a pretty controversial history as far as his social media. In one case in 2015, Zaman shared a link to a website, a pro-Hitler movie called The Greatest Story Never Told, as well as used his social media to share official Hamas press releases, links that literally direct to Hamas's official website. So this is, of course, it's egregious enough to celebrate a terrorist attack that kills 1,200 people, but this individual has quite a controversial conspiratorial social media history.
Well, let me ask you, how did you find out about these meetings, and how is this not something, I guess I'm going to ask this a little tongue-in-cheek, but how did you find out about these meetings, and how is it that the media, who is hyper-focused on, I'm going to air quote this, Donald Trump having dinner with a white supremacist, which was, Trump sort of unwittingly did that, said he didn't know who the guy was. But they always talk about that dinner with Trump, yet, this is the first I've heard of this story. How is it this hasn't been covered by the mainstream media, and how did you find out about these meetings?
Yeah, look, as far as these meetings, they are public record. They are evident in archived press releases on the Minnesota gubernatorial website, where Tim Walz is currently the Democratic governor of Minnesota. As far as coverage of these meetings, so I would just note the Anti-Defamation League sent us a statement, sort of pressing for Walz and other officials to not meet with this individual in the future. You are correct. Many of the same news outlets that were very quick to jump on Donald Trump meeting with Nick Fuentes, who is a white supremacist and is similarly a problematic individual to Asad Zaman, the same outlets that were quick to jump on that have not jumped on this story, which was actually picked up today by the Jerusalem Post, the largest newspaper in Israel as well. So this is certainly developed into a major story, but there has been some sense of media blackout thus far.
We all know that Minnesota has a very heavy Muslim population. You've got Ilhan Omar, of course, Somalians. And so is it possible that, I'm not giving him the benefit of the doubt, but I'm just trying to understand his state of mind. Why would he do this knowing that Hamas, of course, has been perpetually, along with Hezbollah, attacking Israel? They feel like Israel has no right to exist. The relationship with Iran, and Iran funding all of this terrorism. Is there no political downside to him doing this? It just seems awfully brazen to me.
Yeah, look, this is the kind of thing that Republicans were raising concerns over after we published our story, those close to the Trump campaign, asking why it would be acceptable for him to have met with them. I'd note that these meetings, 100% he could have been aware of Mr. Zaman's comments in the past. One of them was in May 2023. That was actually about mosque security, and Zaman had gone to his office separately. One was in May 2020. Another separately, actually, not only did Mr. Zaman, was he hosted by Governor Walz, Actually, Mr. Zaman delivered an invocation speech before a state address that Walz issued, just months, actually, after Zaman appeared at a separate January 2019 event and spoke there. Zaman also attended a Ramadan event in 2019 at Walz's residence. Keep in mind, this is, again, while this is not before him, this is not after him celebrating the October 7th attack, this is years after he shared a pro-Hitler website link on his Facebook and shared an official Hamas press releases as well on his Facebook. So this is all public record, and anyone can go look at these posts if they would like.
One of the things that worries me, of course, Democrats, I mean, I think on the surface, someone like a Tim Walz might say, well, I'm all for, Israel being allowed to defend itself, perhaps. I don't really know, but they'll offer their thoughts and prayers when a terrorist attack against Israel happens. But this is the kind of thing that they're doing, which meeting with people like this guy, and, you quote a guy by the name of Sam Westrup, a terrorism researcher and analyst, and he says that Walz's ties to this guy shows anti-Israel extremists. They may be given a platform in a potential Harris-Walz administration. Is there a lot of concern within the Republican Party that this is something that could happen if, Lord help us, Kamala Harris does win this election?
Look, Sam's sentiment is something that a lot of us were expressing, which is that a concern that a potential Harris-Walz administration would be platforming these kinds of individuals. Keep in mind that Kamala Harris just last week, I believe it was, had said that she was open to an arms embargo on Israel. That was something to the dismay of pro-Israel advocates and lawmakers who are saying that, America ought to support its ally in Israel as it essentially goes to war with Iran, Hamas being a proxy of Iran, Hezbollah, another proxy of Iran. So I think that this story that we put out here is certainly something that, as far as reactions, people were concerned that this is a window into who could be platformed under a President Kamala Harris.
Part of my question would be, has anyone in Minnesota, they obviously have a media in Minnesota, including a very powerful newspaper there. Local media hasn't covered this. Has Tim Walz, the governor, has he come out and said anything about, disavowing what this guy stands for, Zaman, what he stands for?
As far as local media coverage, I'm not aware. I haven't followed every story that's been written up about this. I would note New York Post recently picked it up, Fox, some other news outlets. As far as response, the Harris campaign came out in a statement on Friday, said that Mr. Walz condemns terrorism and that he has no relationship with Mr. Zaman, which evidently, based on our story, is not true. They have some semblance of a relationship given the fact that he's hosted him, and that's pretty self-evident. So that was their response to this story. The White House itself has not put out a statement, but I wouldn't expect that would happen.
In other words, they lied.
As far as their statement, it's self-evident that he has a relationship with this individual. Whether how close that relationship is another question, but he's hosted at events, and one could say, okay, it'd be different if he hosted him at very large events. And, I could understand the Ramadan situation. That was an event with a lot of people. But as far as the other examples we flagged, these are examples in which Mr. Zaman is literally speaking minutes before Tim Walz speaks. So, yes, it
is interesting, too, that Zaman, he promoted a pro-Hitler film called The Greatest Story Never Told.
Correct.
I mean,
correct.
I guess it's stunning. I'm reading this, and I will admit I missed this story from a couple of days ago. I guess part of me is just absolutely stunned that, number one, Tim Walz, he thought that this was okay to even though he lied about it, have a relationship with this guy with this kind of background and these kind of viewpoints and this kind of social media. It almost seems, Gabe, it almost seems brazen that he is just out here with this relationship with this guy and nobody's calling him out but you?
Look, the Anti-Defamation League, an apolitical organization, and I'd note a group that many on the right do not like and find to be problematic for, often targeting the right in their mind. They came out and were very, very quick to say that they found that this individual is highly anti-Semitic, promotes terrorists, and that Tim Walz should not be meeting with him. And they don't just release statements lightly. I mean, this is, again, when I reached out to them for the story, this is the kind of thing where they're going to be cautious. They're a 501c3. They're not supposed to be partisan, but they had no issue weighing in for the story, and that's because it's obviously very clear that this individual is an anti-Semite. I mean, he shared a documentary that glorifies Adolf Hitler and is actually a favorite among neo-Nazis. I'd recommend anyone goes to look that up. It's the greatest story never told. It was made in 2013.
Gabe Kaminsky is with us. He is with the Washington Examiner and talking about the revelations that Tim Walz has been meeting with someone, Assad Zaman, and he's from the Muslim American Society of Minnesota, and some very controversial anti-Semitic views. It is interesting to broaden out on this, where on the one hand, we can talk about Kamala Harris, where on the one hand she is trying to appease the very radical left, and saying things like Israel has a right to defend itself, but then spending a large amount of time talking about how Israel needs to do whatever they can to limit civilian casualties as they try to root out Hamas, conveniently leaving out the part where Hamas, of course, as you know, they use schools and buildings and some of these civilians as human shields, and they burrow underneath these schools and hospitals and so forth. And she leaves that part out. It's almost like, and I'm going to air quote this, Israel has a right to defend itself, but then she'll spend an inordinate amount of time talking about how Israel, seemingly to me, recklessly killing civilians.
Yeah, look, as far as Harris's comments, they speak for themselves, and I would just note that the individual that Tim Walz has been meeting with, Assad Zaman, made very similar comments after October 7th. His initial reaction, his immediate reaction to that news was to say that Palestine has a right, in quotes, Palestine has a right to defend itself. And he also shared a post by a separate Islamist organization that essentially celebrated this attack and had said that it was, years in the making and something that should be lauded. And so, that sort of rhetoric is the kind of rhetoric that is quite favorable to Hamas. And I'm sure Hamas is, the Republicans have said that, they would find a friend in Harris administration, Hamas, but so that seemed to be the reaction.
Do you know what's interesting is, as we wrap this up, and a great interview, and I really appreciate you joining us here on WMAL, is that you would think that this kind of thing would come up in the vetting. I mean, when you're going to be a running mate and when you're being vetted as a, running mate for someone who wants to be president, they go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. And this had to come up. That's number one. And Kamala Harris ignored it, just like they ignored the stolen valor accusations, which, in my opinion, those are not accusations, though that is a fact that he did participate in stolen valor. When you look at all of these things that Tim Walz has been accused of, are you surprised that Harris decided to overlook all of these faults and choose him as a running mate?
Well, I think we're jumping. It's not entirely clear if the Harris team was aware of his prior meetings with this imam. It's also not clear if they necessarily, and as of right now, obviously, would take issue or do take issue with those prior meetings. So I can't I can't speak to their vetting process. I can't speak to what they were aware of, what they were not aware of. That's certainly something that the media should get the opportunity to ask Kamala Harris's team. They've not yet responded to the Washington Examiner's media inquiries, they did send that statement to Jewish Insider that was quite brief and again said, we condemn terrorism, or that Walz does, and that he has no relationship with this individual, but they did not address the substance of whether this was something they were aware of in the past. As far as the military record, that is similarly right, the kind of thing that people are wondering, how are they not aware of this? That's quite more public record than the meetings with this cleric. The military record issue has been around actually for years now with Tim Walz in a much higher profile way. So look, I think these are the questions people should be asking, and it's worth noting again, Kamala Harris has been quite resistant to doing any media since she's become the Democratic presidential nominee, to the dismay of reporters who and more media should be asking to interview Kamala Harris. So
listen, I will say this, Gabe, great job, and you're absolutely right. More reporters should be doing this kind of digging and asking the questions that you are asking. So great job. How can people find you on Twitter?
Yeah, thanks so much. My Twitter is Ge Kaminsky. That's Gekaminsky.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us here on WMAL. Have a great rest of week. Dan Mandis here in for Vince Coglianese, and we are definitely trying to make sense of the news. You can find out more about me on my Twitter, Instagram, Facebook pages, all of them at Dan Mandis Show. I host a morning show in Nashville, Tennessee on Super Talk 99.7 WTN, and you can find more information there on the internet at 997WTN.com. Coming up, one of the earlier in the radio broadcast, I was talking a little bit about some of the things that Donald Trump wants to do. He came out with some official policy positions, and one of the things that he says is that he wants to make American cities safe again. How big of a threat is George Soros? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more straight ahead on 105.9 WMAL. 4:35 on 105.9 FM WMAL. Dan Mandis in for Vince Coglianese. The name George Soros scares any conservative out there, especially if you know what he's done to once great American cities. Dan Schneider is one guy who certainly knows. He is vice president of the Media Research Center and Free Speech America. And Dan, welcome on in to WMAL.
Hey, Dan, thanks a lot. Great to be with you.
So I got to ask you, I mean, most folks who listen to WMAL certainly understand what George Soros has done regarding these, what I would call pro-crime prosecutors, soft-on-crime prosecutors. How many of these prosecutors are around the country?
Well, there are twice as many that are now known as were known before. We have identified 126 of these Soros-backed prosecutors, and they cover 30% of the U.S. population. If you're in an inner city, then you're almost guaranteed to be covered by a Soros prosecutor, meaning that the most vulnerable people in America are the ones who the criminals are allowed to let loose on. But Soros is not only being soft on crime, he's also targeting his political opponents for criminal prosecution. The most obvious example of this is Donald Trump being targeted by Alvin Bragg. It was a coordinated hit job.
I got to ask because I mean, I know all about George Soros, and you're right. One of the things when you talk about a lot of these cities, like, I mean, for example, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, but west of us on I-40 is Memphis, and they've got in my opinion, a Soros prosecutor there. One of the things I think it is safe to say, Dan Schneider, is that if you look at these cities that are just overrun with crime, and the crime is destroying these cities, that's like synonymous with George Soros and these DAs, right?
Yeah, and I want to make one thing really clear. For the first time ever, we have the internal communications from these Soros prosecutors. We got open records laws around the states, and we have 7,785 pages of internal communications between these prosecutors and the whole Soros machine. We now see how George Soros not only got these people elected and appointed, but how he continues to control them. He is the guy on top of the whole system, and he is dictating the policies that they're to pursue. He's even insisting on who they hire into their offices. So in addition to the 126 prosecutors we've been able to identify, there are scads more, especially like these young attorneys who are being installed in these government prosecutorial offices. This is the ultimate corruption of our justice system.
I got to ask, I mean, Soros, from your piece, the Soros empire spent at least $40 million to elect its prosecutors. It then invested an additional $77,663,000 to 20 leftist nonprofits to coordinate and control the prosecutors, so on and so forth. I mean, listen, I'm no lawyer myself, clearly. How does it get away with this?
Well, it's not illegal to have independent expenditure ads for people to run an office. Mm-hmm. It's also not illegal to donate money to organizations, and it's not illegal for those organizations to try to offer their advice and even some of their services. What is unlawful is when you get these prosecutors to collude to break the law. And Dan, this is an important point. The listeners here probably understand prosecutorial discretion. You know, just like any government agency, there's limited resources, and they've got to prioritize, their targets and that sort of thing. What a prosecutor is not allowed to do is unilaterally just determine that he or she is not going to enforce a law, period. And that's what these Soros prosecutors have done. They've signed pledges saying, that laws that limit abortion, that they are not going to enforce those laws. Laws that prohibit gender mutilation, sex change operations for minors, that are not going to enforce those laws. This amounts to a prosecutorial veto. Prosecutorial vetoes are unlawful. This is not mere discretion of a prosecutor. This is unlawful behavior of these prosecutors. And if they're conspiring to do this, that sounds like a RICO violation to me.
I would agree. And again, I'm no lawyer. So then the question is, I know that there have been some, and certainly your organization, the Media Research Center, has been asking Congress to investigate these kinds of things with the Soros. It's not only George Soros, it's his sons too. And from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I could be, but I mean, his sons are right up there with George in this. I don't even know what to call this. It's not, I mean, it's progressive, but it's destructive.
Right. Look, George Soros, and then he's handing the reins to one son in particular, Alex. George and Alex have this perverted sense of society. They don't like tradition. They don't like logic and reason and how those things have helped form a peaceful, cohesive society. They are upending everything. And we've done other reports to show what their direct impact on the media, on politics, and now it's the direct impact on our judicial system. They are upending it. They have installed these prosecutors all over the country, and then they've forced these prosecutors to sign pledges vowing that they shall not enforce the law, and they are doing this contrary to our democratic system. And by the way, Dan, when a prosecutor, one of his prosecutors, decides that she doesn't want to go along with the ride the same way, then Soros targets them for elimination. So Kim Ogg down in Houston, she didn't want to sign some of these pledges. So he mounted a campaign to have her removed. So he really does control these prosecutors, their agendas. And if they don't bow down to him, if they don't follow his lead, he gets them, kicked to the curb, and he'll replace them with somebody else.
Well, and all these district attorneys and so forth, I mean, they're voted in. I mean, we use terms like installed, but I mean, they're voted in. But how Soros controls them is the money for advertising and so forth, right?
Well, in lots of different ways. One thing I found funny in looking at these 7,785 pages of internal communications, lots of these prosecutors got in trouble under their various states' ethics rules because George Soros called them for these meetings, these mandatory meetings, and these prosecutors went to the meetings, paid for by George Soros and his foundations, and all their expenses were paid. But because these lawyers thought that this was just part of their job to respond to him, they didn't report these things as gifts, this travel expenditure. So they got in trouble ethically. George Soros then paid for their defense. He hired lawyers to defend the illegal prosecutors, to try to get them off the hook. But it's just a sign of how these prosecutors really see George Soros as their boss. When he beckons them, they come a running.
Dan Schneider, Vice President of the Media Research Center, Free Speech America, talking about George Soros and really his grip on these very liberal, progressive prosecutors and district attorneys across the country. Would you say that Kamala Harris, I had a guest on a while back on my show in Nashville that said that Kamala Harris was one of the original George Soros prosecutors or DAs going way back to her time in San Francisco. Would you put her in that bucket?
There are three ways that we identify somebody as being a Soros prosecutor. One is if he backed them financially in their races. A second is if they are attending his mandatory meetings, and a third is if they are signing the pledges that he forces on them. If you haven't done at least one of these three things, we don't deem that person a Soros prosecutor. So there are two people that will surprise folks. Kamala Harris, we do not have evidence that she was a Soros prosecutor. And the other one is Fani Willis down in Georgia. We don't have any evidence that she was a Soros prosecutor either. So there can be radical lefties who are not part of that Soros machine, but the majority of these radical lefties in these prosecutorial offices are part of that Soros network.
So let me ask you this. I've got my own opinions, but I want to know what you think. What is in it for George Soros? Like, what are they trying to accomplish by sowing all of this chaos in cities across America? I've got my own opinions, and I'll just go ahead and I don't want to lead the witness because this is just my opinion, and everybody's got one. But I think part of what they're trying to do is bring about all of this chaos because that aids the Democrats in then saying, well, we can fix all of this. The cities are crime-ridden and the schools are terrible, but we can fix all this. And so it gives the Democrats, this is just part of my spiel on this, but it gives the Democrats something to fix, even though really they're the ones that are causing the problem. But it's just this perpetual we can fix it statement that they always make every couple of years.
I can't explain George Soros. He was quoted on video saying that one of the happiest days of his life was when he was a kid in Budapest, Hungary, when the Nazis rolled in. That he and his dad were happy about that, and they collaborated with the Nazis, even though that Soros family originally was Jewish. I can't explain his mind. I cannot understand how somebody who was born into a Jewish family would celebrate Nazis rolling into Budapest, Hungary. I cannot explain somebody who has used the free enterprise system to make hundreds of billions of dollars, and that person then hates free market capitalism. I cannot understand somebody who has taken advantage of the Western tradition then to oppose it. I can't explain it.
Does he hate America, or does he just want America to be in his vision?
Well, look, he hates the very ideas of our nation's founding. He hates the whole system of law and justice that our nation was founded upon. He does not like the democratic system where every single person has a vote. I'm from a small town in Kansas, and I get every bit of a say as his son does about who gets to be president of the United States. He hates that system. The World Economic Forum and these other elitist globalist organizations, they think that only a tiny handful of liberal elites should dictate the rules for the rest of us. And that's ultimately the battle that this whole world is in right now. Will people be allowed to govern themselves? Or will instead there be, if you're a communist Chinese emperor, then, does the party set the rules? Or if you're a European elitist, Do these supranational organizations set the rules? But that's the battle we have today: the people versus the massive elites.
You talk about governors and state attorneys general should remove these law-breaking prosecutors, and is that happening? And is this something that in some of these states that are more conservative, like, for example, I am in Tennessee, and I've been here for almost 11 years now, and by and large, it is a very conservative state, but then we have, the blot on our state, which is Memphis, quite frankly. And so the question is, do local governors and state attorneys general have the power to remove these folks? And are you seeing that?
There are different ways that these prosecutors are going down. Ron DeSantis was able to remove a prosecutor. He was able to show that Soros prosecutor was guilty of negligence in office and got that prosecutor removed. We've had other prosecutors, these Soros prosecutors, who have in fact been indicted for criminal conduct. We saw that in St. Louis, where a particular Soros prosecutor and her deputy were both indicted. The deputy pled guilty, and the Soros prosecutor herself, cut a plea deal and resigned to avoid jail time. And then other prosecutors have been kicked out of office. In these very liberal districts, even these liberal constituents think that these prosecutors are too extreme. And we just saw another prosecutor go down last week. But we've got, about a dozen prosecutors, these Soros prosecutors, who have lost their races for re-election because they're just too extreme, even for their liberal districts.
Well, I think part of what's happening is they're beginning to realize that these kind of policies have led to the destruction of their communities. And so, so if you steal $999.99 worth of stuff, then you're not going to be prosecuted, to people walking around and, beating the heck out of old people, but they're not really charged. I mean, there's all kinds of horrific examples that we've all seen. Is it possible in our final moments that people in these cities are beginning to realize George Soros and these soft on crime policies, and they're beginning to realize that these policies have been leading to and contributing to their city's destruction?
Yeah. San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, Los Angeles, these used to be beautiful cities. And now I literally have been speaking to people who live in those towns, prosecutors who work in those towns. And now it's a fight to say, well, at least we're not as bad as San Francisco, but we're getting there. The people, it's obvious. It's obvious to every voter in those precincts what is going on. And they're all fleeing to Montana or Colorado or Tennessee or Florida and taking their stink with them. Please, if you're going to continue to support terrible policies, stay where you are. Don't export it elsewhere.
Well, you got that right. All right. Well, Dan Schneider, thank you very much for joining us. How can folks find you on Twitter?
Well, I'm at Schneider_DC, and I'm at the Media Research Center, MRC, and I'm the VP for Free Speech America here at MRC.
Love it. Vice President of the Media Research Center, great organization, Free Speech America as well. Thank you for joining us here on WMAL. 4:57, right here on 105.9 WMAL, making sense of the news. I'm really looking forward to next hour. One of my favorite conservative voices. I'm going to try not to fanboy here. One of my favorite conservative voices actually is Mary Catherine Ham. And she is the host of the Getting Hammered podcast. And, of course, she contributes to Fox News. And she's got a lot of great things, I'm sure, to say about J.D. Vance and the Sunday morning news show appearances. And I got to tell you, I've got a lot of great audio from those appearances. And as I was watching J.D. Vance with all of these interviews, I thought, this is precisely exactly why Donald Trump wanted J.D. Vance as a running mate, because he's really good at not only staying on message, but also holding the media accountable. Stay close.